Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone's week is going well. Uh, I see that a lot of people are making good progress with the worksheets online. Let me know if you have any questions, but the questions might get a bit more challenging throughout the semester as they build on other concepts, but that more or less will give you a sense of what we're going to be doing weekly with the worksheets. Everyone seems to be doing well so far, and I would expect more of the same. And mainly, like I said in the beginning of the semester, that'll help you prepare for the exams, things like that. Last class, we started out with, we started talking about the age of the Earth and how the history has evolved, the history of how it evolved in terms of understanding the age of the Earth, where the concepts came from, and how we went from a time frame of, marginally 6,000 years up till about 4.56 billion years, which is accepted today. And really, to summarize that lecture, the thing I want to make sure you absolutely remember is that the key technique that's allowed us to improve our understanding of the age of the Earth, and more importantly, perhaps provide age and time constraints on major events on Earth, like where life started to evolve, how geological processes changed. Give us an idea about sort of the rate cons in which these processes we're going to evaluate in terms of evaluating Earth systems matter. Is we've used radioactive isotope data, right? So that again relies upon elements that are unstable, isotopes that have typically have more neutrons than protons by a good number, and therefore are unstable. They tend to decay. Key things I want you to remember here is they decay with a half-life. That's a time, which is dependent on each individual isotope. But it's a time which half of the material that originated will remain. So after the time frame is that one half is gone. That's the half-life. And that same concept can be used to look at a quarter, an eighth, a 16th, and further divide that amount in half. The key other component I want you to remember is that there are so many different isotopes. I think it's about 900 different radioactive isotopes, maybe about 10 or 12 that are used really commonly in geological sciences, biosciences, things like that, that can be used to sort of determine rate constants using these half-lives. So where we left off on the last lecture, I think was talking about a really prominent National Academy of scientist named Claire Patterson, who actually did his PhD at the University of Chicago and later, I believe, was at Caltech for quite a long time. I believe he retired from there, I should say. And when he was at Chicago, what he started to do was start to use this different radio dating techniques by counting uranium and lead isotopes in very old rocks on Earth. And he was largely setting out to try to determine the age of the Earth with this approach, see what's the age he could find, and then basically he would know at least the age is that old. And he would do things that like looking for the deepest rocks, looking for rocks in terrains that looked to be really heavily weathered and had been exposed to a lot of geological processing. But in reality, for quite some time, was a fairly random exercise where people would get new rocks and basically get ages and find ages, and occasionally the science would put back. And really, I guess I'll take a second here to talk about this. Is that why is it so random? Why is it so hard to find really old rocks on Earth? Well, for starters, without actually having these radio dating clocks, it's not always easy to just tell how old the rock is by looking at it. Some rocks that were buried deeply haven't been exposed to the elements like wind and water and ice and those components. Can look fairly unweathered and look fairly young, whereas rocks that have been near the surface and been ground up by glaciers or rivers or chemical and physical weathering can actually look quite old. So, for starters, it was hard to know what to look for. The bigger problem that I'm asking you as a general question for the class is, why is there a problem finding old rocks on Earth? Or more directly, why can we not really find rocks that really give us the true age of the Earth? The biggest problem here is that the Earth, by definition, I see someone answered in, and I appreciate that. The Earth, by definition, is older than the surface of the Earth is by definition older than the initial time it was formed. Most importantly, plate tectonics have been around recycling these rocks over and over, an unknown number of times. So as a result, it was really hard to actually get a sense of what the age would be based on just looking what's available on the Earth's surface. And therefore, Claire Patterson made what we consider to be today fairly insightful assumption, which is that he recognized that there's a growing theory in astronomy and earth science at the time. It was called sort of the bulk Earth hypothesis. I won't test you on that specific term. Don't worry about that. But basically what they started to realize is that as people measured rocks from all around the Earth, people like Claire Patterson and other geochemists were going all around collecting rocks and measuring them. And then people started collecting meteorites, recognizing they were falling from space. They started to realize that the chemistry of those things were largely similar. And they came up with this theory called the bulk Earth hypothesis, which it said that basically based on all the meteorites they found, all the rocks on planet Earth and in meteorites from other locations outside of our planet, within our solar system, and even outside of our solar system to some extent, were formed by essentially the same minerals. And as a result, they came up with this bulk Earth hypothesis, which stated that there was an initial sort of pre-solar nebula of material. The material was sort of homogenized, had a sort of a constant starting composition, and that the Earth formed from that material. We'll talk about that process a little bit as we go on here today. But basically, what he made the sort of assumption that if in fact we all start from the same solar nebula, not we all necessarily, but the whole, well, including us, but the whole Earth and solar system started from the same protosolar nebula, that he could get ages from various meteorites and extrapolate back to understand where the age of the Earth, extrapolate the age of the Earth. So his assumptions that meteorites are essentially leftover building materials from the early days of the solar system. They managed to preserve the chemistry of that time frame. And what he decided is if he could measure meteorites collected all over the world, he would basically see if this age was reminiscent of the time the Earth formed. And his hypothesis basically stated that, if he was correct, meteorites should all be clustering around a very small age at the time of the Earth's formation. And if he was wrong, if meteorites were really some sort of chaotic, random mixture of things, that he would find that the age didn't cluster very well at all. I'll leave the punchline here in saying that what he found is that there was an incredibly small, narrow age, which led to a lot of credibility to this idea that, in fact, meteorites represented the timing of the formation of our solar system and gave us an idea about the time which the Earth formed. So to give you a sense of this, I know the number of months being trapped inside with COVID and other things can wear on all of us. But it took Patterson about 7 years of really patient and diligent work just to assemble the samples in order to actually test this hypothesis. He went out to a lot of museum collections all across the United States and internationally, try to get access to meteorite samples that were collected. He often went to meteorite impact craters and went around looking for material. And basically, it took him quite a long time to assemble this. About 1953, he started actually measuring these samples at the Argonne National Lab near the University of Chicago. And basically, what he was doing was measuring really small quantities of uranium and lead, look at the relative ratios of each to basically use that half-life we talked about earlier to get back at finding an age of the formation of the Earth. And what he did is he relied upon two different isotope decay chains, uranium-238 to lead-206, and uranium-235 to 207. Don't worry about the specifics of these numbers for now. But basically, he recognized these had two very different half-lives, about 4.47 billion years, which ironically we know now is close to the age of the Earth that he would find, and a different decay system that had a half-life of 704 million years. And basically, he was hoping to find that these would produce the same answer, and a small range of answers that would allow them to get a sense of the age with which the Earth formed. So part of the human side of this, of course, the story goes when Patterson actually got his whole collection of data together using data from meteorites collected all around the world, or at least retrieved from museums all around the world, with these two different techniques with very different half-lives. He was so excited he drove straight to his boyhood home in Iowa. And actually, his mom checked him into the hospital because he thought he was having a heart attack. He had so much anxiety and excitement over determining the age of the Earth. And basically, what he determined at that time with relatively early generations of mass spectrometers, but really careful, diligent analysis of a broad suite of samples, is that if you looked at meteorites from all over the world, he got an age of the Earth about 4.55 billion years old, plus or minus 70 million years. If you want to put this in context, in 1953, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have computers, we didn't have a lot of the capabilities we had today. In fact, when they would make these measurements of the various elements on a periodic table, they'd get little various elements with mass spectrometers on the periodic table. It would actually give a paper printout of the data, and it would be a curve as you measure it across different masses. And to give you a sense of how inaccurate these mass spectrometers were at the time, when the mass spec printed out the data, you would actually take take a pair of scissors and cut the curve of the signal out, and then weigh the actual mass of that curve in order to get a sense of how much of something there was. So imagine all those inaccuracies. And the punchline I'll leave you with here is that he came up with an age at that time, in very early generation technologies where things weren't done like they are now, 4.55 billion years old. And today, I think the accepted age of the Earth is changed to 4.56 billion years old, plus or minus 70 million years. So he was within the accuracy of what our best scientists and best technology could do today. And most importantly, meteorites all around the world, 2 different isotope decay schemes. He got all of the ideas that he hypothesized were that the age of the meteorites were very tightly clustered together, and basically gave the same answer within the 2 different decay series, which allowed him to have pretty good confidence that his idea about the age of the Earth was correct. And just to be clear, it wasn't just one person in 1953. This has been worked on time and time again. Almost every time we get a new suite of meteorites or material, there are scientists that do similar tests, and basically this age has sort of withstood the test of time of 4.55 to 4.56 billion years old. Just as an aside, I will not test you in this, I promise you, but I wanted to bring this to your attention is that luckily for Claire, because this would have been hard to understand at the time, all the meteorites he tested had very minute, very consistent answers. As science has evolved, as we've explored and found more meteorites, we've actually gone out and collected materials from debris from space and from the atmosphere. We've actually now found a separate cluster, just to make you aware of this, of a handful of samples. One is called the Tagish Lake meteorite, which hit Tagish Lake, Canada, which actually are something that's called to be pre-solar or extrasolar meteorite, something that came outside of our solar system, has a very different composition and actually probably is reminiscent of a remnant of a different solar system somewhere else. And in those areas, I think the ages are 8 or 9 billion years. So this technique is also useful for determining the age of other things. So the key component I want to reiterate here, if you're not familiar with this, is that this provides an age of our solar system and our Earth. It does not imply the age of the universe in any way, shape, or form. In fact, most folks believe there's sort of a Big Bang expansion contraction in the history of the planets that suggest our solar system was itself probably recycled to some degree. So to give you a sense of what he was looking at here, one of his classic examples is the Canyon Diablo meteorite, which is out here near the Barringer crater in Arizona. If you haven't been there or you haven't seen it yet, it's a really impressive feature. It's probably only preserved because of its location in a very dry desert that doesn't get a lot of wind damage, but this is one of the more famous examples of a sample he collected to get at the age constraints that he came up with. And give you an example on this one, Canyon Diablo meteorite was important and is still used today as a standard for comparing geochemistry of various meteorites to. But it's an example of a meteorite that sort of was consistent with that age and had an age of about 4.53 to 4.58 billion years ago. Now, the reason I bring up this specific meteorite and this age bracket is that this is, highlighting back what I said earlier here, plus or minus 70 million years. And what people in the scientific community have come to believe now is that actually has a lot of meaning. And this gap in all these this sort of spread in the data, it's probably not just an analytical error, or at the very least, it's much larger than the analytical errors, and probably gives us some indication of the duration of how long it took for the solar nebula to form our solar system, for basically start to collapse into the solar nebula, start to collapse and form the protoplanets, the sun, and actually start to form the individual planets. And this 50 to 70 million year time span is what we believe is required for the accretion of planets from the original solar dust and meteorites that actually make these gravitational eddies that later grew and become the planets. So, some other verification for this work, folks later realized became part of the Apollo mission and other missions to the moon and to collect material outside of our planet, was that people recognized that, as one of our was the person who mentioned that it's hard to find rocks that give you the true age of the Earth because plate tectonics recycle various rocks, is that people recognize that the moon itself had no evidence of plate tectonics. It doesn't have plates. It just has some volcanism and no evidence of plate tectonics or subduction or things like that. And basically, the assumption was that if we could test this hypothesis by looking at samples returned from the Apollo mission, and we got the same age as Claire got originally, and Claire was actually able to do this work, he would be able to verify if this age is correct. And the punchline is that the age of the rocks from the moon were sort of extrapolated back to that same age, and we're really quite consistent, about 4.4 to 4.5 billion years with the age of the moon. And as a result, it's now sort of accepted based on testing that hypothesis that the age of the Earth is about 4.5 to 4.55 to 4.56 billion years old. Similarly, as people started to be able to identify meteorites that came from Mars or Martian meteorites, these have similar ages, and now basically people accept this. For perspective, looking at the concept of the fact that rocks are recycled by plate tectonics, there are a few examples. They're typically called cratons. I'll tell you this vocabulary just for clarity, but I'm not going to test you on little nuanced words like that unless I define them on the slides. But there are some sort of proto-continents. The oldest parts of continents were things sort of created over time. The most famous of which is actually in the area called Jack Hills of Western Australia, which find sedimentary rocks that are about 4.4 billion years old within specific crystals from this area. So to give you a sense of this, from about 4.56 billion years old to 4.40 billion years old, so not 0.16 billion years, which is 160 million years, we went from basically a really hot dust in the solar system to the creation of planets, and actually instilled some form of volcanism, or the earliest seeds of not even pre-plate tectonics, the earliest seeds of the geological evolution of the planet, where we at least know we had volcanism. We had those volcanic rocks get destroyed by chemical and physical weathering and produce sedimentary rocks, and the sedimentary sequences we observe from Jack Hills that are recorded there. So if you have a sense that even though 160 million years is a really long time for us, it's relatively short geologically, you can conceive of the fact that we went all the way from dust to the precursor of plate tectonics in 0.16, in 160 million years. That's pretty impressive to think about, I think. So where this is going to sort of take us from now, and where we're going to spend most of the rest of the lecture probably today and Friday, is thinking about how we went from dust at 4.56 billion years old, to having some precursor of plate tectonics by 4.4 billion years old, all the way to life we have right now, which is obviously evolved. Plate tectonics have started and evolved, and there's a whole variety of sort of geological factors that we've built over 4.56 billion years. I'm anthropomorphizing it by saying we built it. We, of course, didn't do anything, but which has evolved on planet Earth over 4.56 billion years to lead to where we're at now, and to build the linked Earth systems we're going to try to understand. So what I'm going to spend a lot of time is sort of taking you through this time wheel, if you will, to see and go through what is all has happened. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to define the various names and ages of different components of Earth's history. And then I will take you through how things evolved, particularly as it relates to life and plate tectonics during that time frame. So the way you want to interpret this, at midnight, or 12 o'clock, I should say, I meant to say, that's the beginning of the Earth, and we are going to run this as a wheel. It comes right around to basically this being the end of the day here, if you will. So I already alluded to it, 4.55 billion years old, or dust, we start to accrete planets, and basically by about 4.52, so not very long, but 30 million years, we recognize the formation of the moon. And for those of you who haven't really thought about this or haven't learned about this in the past, today the accepted theory for the formation of the moon is that during the early parts of the evolution of these planets, shortly after the solar nebula started to form protoplanets and eventually accreted most of the mass of the solar system into the sun, about 99.9%, leaving behind the planets we know today. There were 9 when I started. I still think of Pluto as a planet, so 8 planets we consider today. This all happened very quickly, right? But in addition to that, there was also a lot of material left in the solar system that hadn't really had enough of a gravitational center to form another planet or form a mass. Perfect example. This is the meteorite belt between between Mars and Jupiter, right? And as a result, it's a period of intense planetary violence, or interplanetary violence, where there's a lot of meteorites, there's a lot of collisions, there's comets, meteorites, and dust, for that matter, hitting each other. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with this, today it's accepted that probably somewhere around the Pacific Ocean, a large meteorite hit the Earth and actually kicked a large mass of material off into space that was hot enough and had enough of a gravitational center that reformed the Earth's moon by about 4.5 billion years old. So that's a perspective that's thought to be true based on the consistency and all the chemistry between those different areas. But that gives you a sense of a period of the early part of Earth's history where things are very hot. There's a lot of volcanism. There's a lot of toxic gases and acidic gases being released. There's probably a lot of meteorite strikes and comet strikes. Have a major collision producing the formation of the moon. Think about the size of that; it's small compared to planet Earth, but we lost an appreciable amount of mass from our planet to the moon at that time. And basically, this period is all known as the Hadean. And in reality, when we think about the Hadean, I'll talk about some specifics here in a second. But it's an area of geological history we just don't know much about. And the reasons are exactly what we just discussed already, that the Hadean was so violent. There was a sort of probably the start and stop of a lot of attempts at plate tectonics. Many people believe there was probably the start and stop of many aspects of early forms of life that may have evolved, may have started to evolve and were killed off. At this point, honestly, we don't know the answer to that very much. And it remains one of the least understood periods of geology just because we, quite frankly, can't get samples to test that. I got a question here about what makes folks believe the moon was ejected from the Pacific Ocean. And basically, it's gravimetric data, which basically looks at how much of material is actually, the mass of material actually, of course, determines the gravitational balance of the gravitational force of that area. And the interpretation, and as far as I know, this is still the up-to-date interpretation, is that the Pacific is the location because of the fact that there's approximately the same amount of mass of the moon has been lost in that region of the Earth, where the sort of mass of the mantle in that area seems to have been lost and hasn't been fully recycled. But I'll post some of the if people are interested, I'll post some of the literature about that on the website later this week, so people can look at that. But to give you a sense here about the Hadean, even though it's such a violent period of meteorite impacts and comet impacts and losing things like the moon, we actually by the end of it, before we get to the first the 1 billion year old birthday of the Earth, we probably have actually seen both the end of the heavy bombardment of all this planetary violence, where materials sort of sorting itself off and finding its home and hitting various planets, not just ours, but the moon, Mars, etc. Many objects, of course, going in the sun. And before we get out of the Hadean, we actually probably see the first forms of simple life forms. These are called prokaryotes. They're single-celled organisms that have no cell wall and no DNA, and those kick in, as early as the Hadean. I'm going to go through specific aspects of this. I just want to give you a sense of this on this big image that, by more than halfway through the history of the Earth, we probably still only had the earliest form of prokaryotic life, very simple life forms, no cell walls, no DNA. There's still, as I'll talk about in a minute here, very little understood about how they formed or evolved. And in fact, it was, I'll talk more about these individual units in a second here, but it was, more halfway through the Earth before we actually started having oxygen, in the atmosphere, and had other life forms even start to evolve on planet Earth. So let's jump in just to hammer this home. We're going to round up here to 4.6 billion years ago. Gas and dust, probably about 15 billion miles across, start to accrete planets. Again, about the vast majority, about 99% of that mass, is in the sun and remains there today. Of the of all the material left over, 0.1% of that, slowly accreted by, individual dust particles bumping into each other, probably randomly, joining by electrostatic forces, and then basically accreting bigger and bigger, particles that actually led to the formation of the Earth. The larger and larger clumps eventually become planetesimals. We suspect, if you talk about planets and planetoids, we suspect there's probably at least 10, if not more, originally. The meteorite belt between Mars and Jupiter is thought to be, a planet that basically formed and then broke up again because it wasn't stable. And of that, we basically start to make these planets. Probably, within the first 200 million years, we have at least 10 or more planets and planetoids that are formed, and the Earth being an important one of them. So, keying in the key aspects of the Hadean here, this is an intense period of late bombardment, meteorite bombardment, comet bombardment, and in reality, a lot of what led to the Earth, of what the Earth looked like coming out of this period, is considered to be, I think, fairly random, and sort of you can think of it as a philosophical question: is how many random components in the Hadean in all this sort of interplanetary violence led to the Earth we have today. So, in addition to the fact that we have a lot of bombardment, remember this is a period of Earth's history where we talk about where the heat of that formation is really relevant. So that's called the latent heat, the heat that's trapped in the Earth as it starts to form this larger planetary body. Things are probably very often melting. There's a large volcanic activity that basically at this point still predates plate tectonics, but as a result of both that latent heat of the planetary formation and the decay of the early isotopes from probably the remnant solar nebula, or the remnant material that led to the solar system being formed. That radioactivity also produces a lot of heat. As a result, there's a lot of volcanic activity early on, in addition to these sort of meteorite and comet impacts. But still, again, by about thought to be about 4 billion years ago, the simplest forms of life started to form. Again, that's just the furthest back we can find evidence for, or indication of it. In reality, the further back you get, that data gets fewer and fewer and far between, and more difficult to interpret. And often, there's a discussion about the fact that we probably had things happening even before then. We just aren't able to record. So I want you to think for a second here. What are the conditions you need to actually even think about having life? Let alone, this is a question that's going to go on throughout the rest of today's lecture. It's not just how do we create something that's living. Not only how do we create the biomolecules we need. You actually have to sort of realize you have to create some sort of landform, right? We can certainly have things that can live in water, live on land, even live in the subsurface, in sedimentary rocks and igneous rocks, for that matter, once they've cooled down, obviously. But at the very least, this tells us we have to have some sort of proto-continent that has some place for us to go. Before this, there's such active volcanism and such high heat flux from the Earth. It's thought of as sort of being a sort of a not exactly a soup, but a very volcanic area without even any really clear oceans, right? For perspective, by less than around 4 billion years ago, we think life started to form. But with that in perspective, the Earth probably wasn't even solid until about 3.9 billion years old, and it's thought that life formed very quickly after that. I mentioned this sort of late bombardment and interplanetary violence a few times now. This is sort of of course, a artistic rendering. We have no idea what this really looked like. Be clear about that. But most folks sort of think of it as almost like you'd think of a magma chamber or a magma a lake in a volcano with lava coming up and sort of cooling off a little bit and becoming gravitationally unstable and sort of falling back into this molten soup. Maybe some sort of solidified crusts of cooled material on the surface, with occasional comets and meteorites and other things sort of hitting on top of the Earth. And quite frankly, we don't know how plate tectonics started, but a lot of folks suspect it was when we found an area, perhaps it randomly didn't get planetary violence, or perhaps it's because it didn't randomly get volcanic center in those areas, that cooled and solidified and started to form the earliest precursors of the cratons that eventually became the plates we think of now. So back to this question, we know we have to have some sort of cooled landmass, and maybe it's just simply a cool landmass that goes for a little while. Life gets started and it falls back into the earth and becomes unstable, but we don't know. But let's take a moment and think about how to build a habitable earth, a habitable earth, excuse me. So how did life form? And quite frankly, I'm going to disappoint you, but at least I'll do it before I get to the punchline here. Is the punchline is right now we really just have a lot of theories. We don't have a very clear answer. There are definitely many theories, and many of them that are still sort of past the scientific rigor. But one of the most famous examples was an experiment in 1953. Notice this is a big year for the earth sciences and for the the evolution of geochemistry and geobiology and understanding of the Earth's history for a lot of different reasons. I'll take a moment as an aside here. Does anyone have a guess as to why there's so much activity in 1953? Does anyone have a wild guess to why Claire Patterson's measuring meteorites and Stanley Miller is about to do some really cool experiments we'll talk about in a second? Yep, Natalie and Luke and whoever just said this, perfect example. World War II has ended. Folks came back from the wars, went to college, started PhD programs. The American economy is booming, so there's a lot of investment in research. And also, when that happened, you saw a great development of technology. So nothing. I'm not advocating for war when I say this in any way, obviously, but there's nothing like the development of new technology besides some sort of conflict, and the new technology in electronics and physics and mass spectrometry were explosive this time. What's even more astounding, if you want to think about the history of science, is that Claire Patterson and Stanley Miller both not only did some of the most important work in terms of understanding the age of the Earth, and in terms of, as I'll get to in a second, understanding the evolution of life, but they actually both worked in the same laboratory and with the same PhD advisor, a professor named Harold Urey, who's at the University of Chicago. So there's a famous experiment here called the Miller-Urey experiment. And basically what they did is they really probed this question: what would you need to build a habitable Earth? And what they came up with, based upon what was known about biology at the time, is that at the very least you'd probably need water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. So that's H2O, CH4, NH3, and H2. But if you think about that, that is effectively, four different elements that are involved in sort of this planetary soup in which you could expect biomolecules to start to assemble. And their idea, beyond putting those four components into a beaker, was that basically you needed some form of energy, an external energy, to catalyze the reaction. Now, once biology had its processes started, it could sort of self-replicate and mimic it as long as it had an energy source that it could derive that catalyst. And basically, it's a pretty crude experiment, although honestly, it's still cutting edge in terms of what it did. Is they put those components, water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, in there. They didn't just choose those randomly. They chose those largely because of the fact that those were abundant at the time the Earth formed. And basically what they did is they ran an electric current through those gases, cycled water through, and created a little probe here to actually look at what was coming out. And what they proved is that they could, with relatively low amounts of energy, and with those components, they could produce biomolecules, that organic chemicals that are important for biomolecules. One of the things I'm going to highlight for you here is the presence of methane. Does anybody find it kind of curious thinking about life evolving to have methane in it? I mean, if you think about life on planet Earth today, we have CO2 in the atmosphere, with nitrogen in the atmosphere, we have oxygen in the atmosphere. But notice here we have methane, and none of those components I just mentioned, nitrogen or oxygen, are really directly in the reaction. So I won't make anyone guess about chemistry. I'll move on. But the first thing I want you to think about here is that when life formed, and even as life is set up on planet Earth today, the Earth is itself a pretty, as far as we know, unique, and that's in the proper use of that word. Not unique means one of a kind. As far as we know, we anticipate, based on statistics, there's other life forms out there and other planets that can have life. But as far as we know, it's very unique in the sense that it actually has today an oxidizing environment. We have oxygen in the atmosphere. We have CO2 in the atmosphere, but that's a problem compared to looking at most of the other forms of planets we've observed. Even looking at the moons of Jupiter that have maybe even have water, they still have methane and other components there. So for starters, these components are not necessarily obvious. They're going to be available in all environments, but they were available in the early part of the Earth. And it's important to recognize early on that oxygen is deleterious to life and not really part of the equation, which we'll talk about more in a second. Punchline of all this is the Miller-Urey experiment proved that you could assemble biomolecular precursors, both these components and an energy source. And Miller and Urey quite famously quoted saying, after observing these things, that they could be wrong, they could be right, but if God didn't do it this way, he missed a pretty good bet. And I think that point's still pretty well taken. It's a mechanism that could form the biomolecular precursors that are important or essential for life, that was available with all the components that were abundant on the early planet, and even lightning and other forms of energy like that are present as well, particularly related to the planetary violence and meteoric bombardment we talked about earlier. Now today, of course, whatever we're talking 70 years later, people have carried out more realistic experiments and different atmospheric conditions. And most importantly, what I'm going to tell you is that we have no idea if this is right, but we have, in the most modern state of science, managed to synthesize the same organic molecules that they did in the original experiments. So, punchline here is that we do have at least a viable and fairly well scientifically accepted theory of how we can make organic molecules, but that's not life, right? That's the precursors, the biomolecular precursors for life. So how do we reach the next stage of complexity? How do we have organisms form? How do we have organisms start to replicate these materials? And quite frankly, this is also still relatively poorly understood. There's still a number of theories that explain this, but basically we'll start from the simpler ones and make you aware of them, and we won't go into any super great detail, but make you aware of them at least. The one theory is called the RNA, or the ribonucleic acid world. And the key aspect there is that RNA can catalyze its own replication, and it can catalyze the formation of proteins. However, the question still became, and I think it's largely still unknown, is non-biological synthesis of RNA possible? And it's not well known, and to this point hasn't been proven. The second theory is that sort of a similar but a lipid world, where you actually sort of start getting double-walled bubbles of fatty cells, organic fats, made theoretically by inorganic processes, and they can be generated by some sort of interaction, perhaps controlled by lightning strikes or the energy from ionizing radiation or something like that. And they can form things like liposomes that could be over time able to reproduce and create things like nucleic acids that could be made from these components. Now, I'm not going to, again, just for clarity in the online world here, I'm not going to test you on the specifics of these things. You'll get a sense of types of questions from the questions on the worksheets, but I want to highlight you're aware of these different theories, RNA versus lipids, that sort of self-assembled. You'll notice that both of these sort of rely on the idea there's some sort of randomness again, just like the way our planet was put together, just like what was present on Earth. It's still not very well sorted out, and you could see there'd be a lot of opportunity for starts and stops and re-changes and how this would go. The other theory, or another theory, is called the iron sulfur world, and basically the punchline of this is that amino acids and peptides could actually be formed in the presence of carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and with catalysts such as iron and nickel. And that basically by catalysts related to these things, you can actually, at very low temperatures and pressures, basically create the precursors of life. So I have a question for you here, is that, where can we find carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, iron and nickel at temperatures of, between 100 and 250 degrees and at high pressure, right? There's a challenging scenario there to think about the fact that we probably, if this theory is true, and it has a lot of merit, it would have to be either in scenarios where we have geothermal sources, such as near magnetism or volcanism. The other component here is that recognizing that it has to have a pressure component is that it implies that it would have to actually follow likely follow the formation of plate tectonics, right? So, it's another philosophical question here, but most folks now believe that you probably had some evidence, some cycling of plate tectonics, formation of rock units that could actually bury these organic molecules that are formed, or at least the precursors, to enough pressures at depths. Okay, and that is implied in the fact that, if you think about an early protoplanet, volcanism might be bringing material out, but there's not really an entrainment of those gaseous components that are produced in our proto-atmosphere back into the planet. So most folks suspect now that plate tectonics is an important precursor, at least in this iron sulfur theory, for creating enough pressure to get some of that prokaryotic life started. And one of the theories that's caught a lot more attention recently is the clay theory. And basically, it's a similar idea to the iron sulfur world. It relies on the fact that there's sort of a catalytic nature to clay. And basically, what's been shown is that there's an emergence of, the fact that these techniques can be, or these theories can be sort of combined. In essence, that clay, for those of you who don't know, is an aluminosilicate remnant of volcanic rocks, basically volcanic rocks that form, they chemically and physically whether they break down, and that what's left over is alumina silicate oxide. And that clay can be really fine grained, can have a lot of surface area, and as a result, it can sort of hold molecules. To oversimplify the idea, it can hold molecules in place and allow them to sort of react to each other and catalyzed. So it's thought that it could play a role in doing so. And some of the more recent work is basically looking at various clays that suggest that it could help polymerize RNA and other biomolecular precursors and sort of help catalyze life. Now, I'm going to spend just one more moment on this. The key aspect of what we've advanced in terms of theories, in terms of the iron sulfur world and the clay theory since the timing of Miller and Urey, is of course fantastic, but they actually aren't necessarily different theories. These last two theories actually are creating ways where you need less energy to actually assemble the RNA or the lipids that Miller and Urey talk about in their earliest experiments. So my point here is that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. A lot of them could be playing a role together. At the very least, we think we had to have a stable, relatively cool planetary surface that probably looks like a precursor to plate tectonics, or some early version of plate tectonics that allowed sedimentary units to be put together that incorporated both opportunities to interact with both temperature, pressure, and these molecules probably in the rocks or in fluids near the surface. So all theories, we don't actually know the answer very well, but what we can say at the very least is that by just less than 4 billion years ago, we managed to actually have some formation of biomolecular precursors leading to life. The big transitions between the Hadean and the Archean, which we're just introducing now, is the fact that the Archean is the timing in which we see the earliest formation of the global oceans. So I have a question. Does anyone here have any idea about what happened in the Archean that we started to see global oceans forming? So while I wait for hopefully for some answers, I'll provide a little bit of information for the context we think about. We have to have the Earth cool and enough to actually allow water to be present in a liquid form. Okay, we have to have some atmosphere. Thank you, Austin. Great guest. If there's some atmosphere that actually can allow the precipitation to accumulate in those areas. There's another component that we need that we haven't really talked about yet, which is we need water, right? Does anyone have a guess as to where most of the water on planet Earth comes from? Or how water got onto Earth? Yeah, John, fantastic contribution there. So there is water on the Earth's mantle. A lot of it's bound to mineral phases, and there's thought to be water that was accreted during, the hydrogen and oxygen, of course, are accreted during the planet. But most of the water on planet Earth, I've seen estimates, ranging up from the majority of it to, at least 2/3 of it, come from what's called tertiary accretion, and that basically means meteorites, comets, and what's called interplanetary dust particles, small particles that have water in them that hit the Earth after the Earth was cool enough, after the Earth had an atmosphere that could actually retain the water when it got here, that hit the Earth and allowed the Earth to accumulate with water. So we're not the only planetesimal body in the universe or the solar system that has water, but we are, you know, in the window of areas where water was able to be here and in the in liquid form. And you know, most of that probably came by planetary bombardment, probably throughout the Hadean, and actually as things got cool enough, you know, during the Hadean transition to the Archean, where that water was actually accumulated in oceans and also got incorporated into plate tectonics. On that topic, one of the really important things about planet Earth is the fact that we actually have plate tectonics. It's a fairly rare beast. There are the examples on Mars of Olympus Mons being a much larger volcano than any volcano we have on Earth. But those scenarios, just like the moon, it's the radioactive decay and the latent heat that accumulates that allows volcanism to start, and that volcanism can, you know, spill out and make a big volcano, for example. But it's actually the presence of water itself is thought to be one of the leading drivers that allowed plate tectonics to sort of be stabilized and evolve with time. So, you know, in addition, the last component of us having oceans is thought to be related to the fact that we can actually see plate tectonic environments where we're going to recycle these materials and create, you know, both accrete continents and create locations where volcanism will be more sort of centralized and allow the more dense material have topographical differences, allowing ocean basins to be formed. But this formation of the ocean is thought to be really important for the ongoing evolution of life. There's certainly an infinite amount of things we don't know, and are thought to be unknowable by the fact they're not preserved in the rock record. But we expect this is a period where we see a continued evolution of single-celled life forms, of those prokaryotes. You know, at the probably somewhere at the beginning of the Archean, but a billion years in, we see what are called blue-green algae, who, while we don't know why or how exactly, saw the earliest evidence of photosynthesis. And the reason we you know, expect that photosynthesis occurs, you know, at least by 3.5 billion years, somewhere around there, is evidence in something called the banded iron formations. And these are present all around the world. There are many of them, many examples of this in quarries in, I think, Wisconsin and Michigan. Basically, this is an early part of the Archean where, you know, at that time, all the elements that were dissolved in, you know, weathering, physically and chemically weathering from rocks on the planet started to accumulate in the oceans. But it wasn't until there was actually enough photosynthesis to make there be free oxygen in the atmosphere that you saw the iron go from sort of dissolved metallic iron to actually iron oxides, and then massively precipitated out and led to these large formations of iron and nickel oxides. They're called banded iron formations that are present in a lot of parts of the world that are currently still mined for iron ore. So, you know, this is obviously implies there had to be free hydrogen and water in order to develop oxygen as a waste product. Okay. What's important here, and again, coming back to this, I want you to consider this, the uniqueness of the Earth currently having an oxygen-rich environment, is that, quite frankly, oxygen production was really bad news for a lot of the bacteria that lived in this early forms of oceans. Oxygen is very toxic in the anaerobic world, and even to this day, you know, even in humans, oxygen is pretty toxic to our white blood cells. We actually we bring oxygen and combine it in hemoglobin and things like that and use it, but actually our body does a lot of processes in our body are largely focused on reducing the oxygen levels, such that the oxygen that's free oxygen inside the body is actually used by our white blood cells to basically kill off well, I call them invaders here, with, you know, components that aren't healthy for us. And the body does a lot of active work to reduce the atmospheric levels now to about 1/10 of what the current atmospheric oxygen levels are. So you know, here's an example of something called stromatolite. They're located in Shark Bay, Australia. They were discovered and more accurately probably understood around 1961. Well, these are examples of the first sort of blue-green algae mats and first evidence of life forms that evolved during these conditions, where there's just singular cellular organisms layering on top of each other, creating these sort of mats that look like mushrooms in the Shark Bay there. You know, again, these are largely cyanobacteria, dust, and whatever's floating around the ocean that sort of make these layers. So it's sort of biological, you know, the cyanobacteria cells on top of a layer of sediments and dust. They build an infrastructure, get more dust onto just these intermittent layers. Those two things, the earliest forms of life. So at this point, I'm going to take a step back to our chart here. We're moving into the Proterozoic, which is part of the Proterozoic is part of the time where we see pretty significant evolution on Earth. and this is the a part of the great oxidation events. So even though we had these band iron formations, we see these continued increases in oxygen, implying increasing rates of photosynthesis. We see this change in the chemistry of what we actually find in these global oceans and probably early lakes, where the chemical weathering wouldn't just let everything be dissolved in the water, but actually as metallic forms, we actually start seeing metal oxides formed. In many cases, that scavenges or removes elements like iron from the global ocean waters into these oxide minerals, and for that matter, creates some problems itself for life, right? We're aware of things like iron being essential metal, but there's a philosophical reason to think about the fact that probably relates back to processes that happened 3.5 billion years ago, where basically the body was used to having abundant metallic iron in its, not the body, the human body wasn't around, but where cells were used to having metallic iron available for use in biological processes, potentially even as a catalyst. So we start to see for other factors as well. Once oxygen gets into the atmosphere, we can start to see ozone, free oxygen, O2 in the atmosphere. We can start to see it interact with UV radiation from ozone, which is very toxic to life. But for perspective, even though we had 1 billion years going, within 1 billion years, we went from dust to earliest forms of life, early precursors to plate tectonics, formation of this, sedimentary igneous and metamorphic rocks tied to those earliest parts of plate tectonics. It took about 2 billion more years, 2 billion years, so about 1 billion more years to reach a scenario where we had sustained free oxygen in the atmosphere, and really we haven't looked back from there. One of the interesting things this created was something we call snowball Earth, which is this period during which the Earth, based on the fact that oxygen was available, oxygen was being formed by photosynthesis, which basically draw down carbon dioxide and also converted the scenario where the methane was no longer present in the atmosphere, but actually was too oxidized and became CO2. We actually went into a period called snowball Earth, which I believe is about 600 million years ago. It ended, I'll get back to you on that. I actually just drew a blank on the age of that. But during the snowball Earth, I think it was actually maybe 1.6 billion. I'll have to look that up. I apologize. Where the Earth cooled dramatically, and basically what we know about the Earth at the time was covered largely by ice and glaciers, around the world, probably even down through the equatorial parts of the world. And the question there, and it still remains a very important question in the earth sciences, is how do you actually come out of a period where everything starts to be frozen, where you see life be fairly limited, and even ocean life gets fairly limited in that cool world. The leading theories are typically tied back to things like volcanism or meteorite impact, something like that, to sort of change the cycle, but it remains a pretty big question today. So here's a artistic rendering of what ice house or snowball Earth may have looked like. There are limited areas where there's not frozen oceans where life is sustained, but probably had some significant challenges and had to evolve during this. To be clear, snowball Earth was during the Proterozoic. I just lost track of the time in my head. I'll get back to you about that. So, in addition to that, the Proterozoic was really fundamentally important because of the fact that we see life transition from being prokaryotic to eukaryotic. And that basically, you can think of that as a bacterial cell that actually has a cell wall. It was actually capable of metabolizing oxygen, basically utilizing it, changing it, combining with iron, for example, hemoglobin. And what's thought is that we tend to think of that this fact that there's some combinations of these things, or maybe prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells sort of enter or combine and sort of carry into these dual capabilities where they could live in oxygen-free and oxygen-rich environments, for example. So what's thought about here in terms of the evolution of eukaryotes is that smaller cells start to survive inside the larger cell. They had the smaller cells had the capacity to use oxygen, where maybe the larger cell did not. And basically, there's this sort of symbiotism where the larger cell's waste products could be used by the smaller cell to drive energy based on the fact they had what's called the capacity to change the redox conditions, moving things from oxidizing to reducing, or add or subtract electrons, really what we're talking about here. And then the excess energy could be used by the host, and that created the scenario where smaller cells could replicate and could sort of feed the larger cell, and the symbiosis is really what's thought to kick off the eukaryotic life. And then, although there's still a lot of unknowns in this theory, is that over time the cells could start to acquire genes. These genes could be used to replicate, self-replicate, and pass them down, so that the by the end of this eukaryotic symbiotism, the larger cell sort of could not survive the energy produced in the smaller cells, but in the aggregate, these larger cells can become more and more complex and lead to different components of more complex life forms, I guess is the simplest way to say it. At some point, these eukaryotic cells, the symbiotism got to the point where you can start to consider these as organisms, where the organism can have cells with different functions, which now we start to classify as organelles, or, for example, called mitochondria, the energy centers of larger life forms. And really at this point, we're off. So key components I want you to actually remember here, I'm introducing them so you're aware of them, is that the key aspect here is that most aerobic bacteria were pretty recently evolved. They were able to enter these sort of more complicated eukaryotic cells. They really initially probably came there as largely as a parasite, but based on the fact that they could operate in oxidizing conditions, but the whole organism could actually operate and sort of avoid this oxygen toxicity. The symbiotism eventually allowed the cells to sort of develop as mitochondrial energy centers within the cells, leading to more complex forms of life and enabling things like the formation of specialized cells, organelles, to do things like photosynthesis, chloroplasts, or to transport oxygen like hemoglobin. A lot uncertain how this exactly evolved, but the key aspect here is that this is all through the Paleozoic here the second snowball Earth ended by 635 million years. So I apologize, I lost track of that number, but it was ended by about 635 million years ago. So really, what this takes us into now is what's called a Phanerozoic, which starts about 542 million years ago and goes up to about 251 million years ago, which includes up to 251 million years ago, which includes the evolution of basically the end of snowball Earth, all the way, the rapid radiation of life, all the way up to something called the Permo-Triassic boundary, which is one of the major mass extinctions that sort of eradicated most of the life that was formed. Sorry, I just got this question. Yeah, cell symbiotic theory is one of the main theories used to describe that. I'll go back to, but I'll post some information on that on the website. So the Paleozoic the Phanerozoic really consists of 3 eons, and the Paleozoic is one of the most important. The Paleozoic, in addition to being the following up on the end of the snowball Earth and sort of seeing life come back, the Paleozoic was really the part of the Earth's history where we start to see things like the things we think of as fossils today, the earliest evolution, and where it really starts something called the Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian explosion is not a bad thing. In this case, the Cambrian explosion is actually where we start to see the first radiation of life, of complex life, I should say, pardon me. And the Cambrian explosion is where we start to see things, things like trilobites and the small fossils we find in Ohio. And in fact, relevant to being here in Ohio State, the Cambrian explosion, the Burgess Shales, is a shale rock that's identified here in New York and other areas. The Appalachian Basin, which includes Ohio and a lot of the rocks and shales in Ohio, is actually a fairly important part of understanding this, because the fossils that allowed us to sort of understand a lot of these components actually were located right in Ohio, and it's actually why the Ohio State Earth Science Department has a really prominent paleontology group, and has had that for quite a long time. So this is where more complicated life forms start to evolve. You start to see animals sort of evolve right out of the end of the snowball Earth, and really the Paleozoic actually incorporates up to the area where we start seeing things evolve to be on land. So it wasn't until about what's called the Devonian period, about 380 million years ago, which is tied to around the time of something called the Marcellus Shale. You might have heard about in the news, one of the major shales extracted for oil and gas throughout the northeast United States, particularly in Ohio and Pennsylvania, West Virginia, is actually where you start to see plants start to transition, or land plants start to evolve, and then eventually land animals start to evolve. So Paleozoic's, just the last, 500 million years. So it's, 1/8 of the, started within 1/8 of the history of the Earth, but actually went from the form where we had the first evolution of complex animals all the way through radiation of land plants, and eventually land animals, starting by the end of the Paleozoic. One of the key things I want to highlight here is that you notice that I said something earlier. Maybe you didn't catch. Maybe I didn't really express the importance of this. But notice that I said that as we transitioned out of the snowball Earths, we saw the first radiation of animals, and that might seem sort of complicated. I just presented to you that although I had a mental block on the age of the snowball Earths that I apologize for, but I just presented to you that the snowball Earth sort of made life really hard and actually led to probably major extinctions of simple life forms of proterozoic, of prokaryotic and eukaryotic life forms during that time. But notice this sort of observation that's occurred here is that at the end of that snowball Earth, even when all the life forms have been reduced dramatically and the areas which life can evolve on, or can exist on Earth has been reduced, it actually becomes a period where we see massive radiation of new species following these mass extinctions. So we don't tend to talk about the snowball Earth as being a mass extinction per se, because the life forms are so basic and hard to sort of understand. I just realized I've gone too far. Thank you for telling me. I will stop there, and I apologize for going past my time. If anyone has any, I'll send an email out with the slides and post online. Sorry.